States. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
3 years ago this month, our next guest, Navy Lieutenant Steve Simmons, was stationed aboard the USS Ronald Reagan off the coast of Japan. The aircraft carrier provided humanitarian assistance in the days after the massive 9.0 magnitude earthquake and tsunami devastated Japan's northeast coast. Simmons, along with thousands of other emergency responders on the USS Reagan, were diverted from their naval exercises in the Pacific Ocean and steered to Japan's decimated coastline to distribute food parcels, clothes, and blankets to victims. At the time, they were unaware they were entering into an unprecedented nuclear crisis, a triple meltdown at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station.
Shortly after returning home, Steve Simmons blacked out while driving. Then he began regularly experiencing gastrointestinal problems and soaring fevers. Within months, Simmons' legs buckled. He was no longer able to walk. He's one of many first responders who say they've experienced devastating health ailments since returning from Japan, health ailments ranging from leukemia to blindness to infertility to birth defects. Simmons is now part of a class action lawsuit against the plant's operator, Tokyo Electric Power Company, or TEPCO, that accuses the utility of failing to disclose the risks of radiation exposure. Navy sailor Lindsay Cooper and Marine Matthew Bradley are also part of the lawsuit.
It's degenerative disease in my lower back, and I have no family history of it, and I have no accident that could have caused it, and I have some digestion problems as well, and stomach pain as well.
Right now I have a lot of weight issues and thyroid issues that I didn't have before I came in, and issues that I didn't have after I had my child. But I'm just, I personally can't afford to go to a doctor and get checked out like the others can. I'm kind of almost nervous, if you want to say. I'm really nervous to find out what's going to happen.
That was Lindsay Cooper and Matthew Bradley speaking to the Ecological Options Network. Now, recently obtained phone conversations suggest the U.S. Navy was also aware of the risk faced by sailors on the USS Ronald Reagan responding to the Fukushima disaster. The conversations, obtained under the Freedom of Information Act, feature naval officials who acknowledge that even while 100 miles away from Fukushima, the carrier was exposed to levels of radiation that were 30 times greater than normal.
The transcript also contains discussion of health impacts that could come within a matter of 10 hours of exposure, including thyroid problems. However, the Navy leadership continues to deny sailors were exposed to harmful levels of radiation, even though those aboard were later told to scrub the ship and equipment in protective suits. Democracy Now! Invited a member of the Navy to join us on the show, but they declined. However, Lieutenant Greg Relson of the Navy's office did speak to us briefly, saying service members who participated in Operation Tomodachi, the Fukushima relief effort, were not at risk of radiation poisoning.
There's no indication that any U.S. personnel supporting Operation Tomodachi experienced radiation exposure at levels associated with the occurrence of long-term health effects. The Tri-Service Dose Assessment and Registry Working Group studied the available data. Their report, which was peer-reviewed by a non-government council of subject matter experts, determined that the highest whole-body dose to any crew member doesn't present any risk greater than normally accepted during everyday life.
Well, for more, we are joined now by three guests. In Washington, D.C., Lieutenant Steve Simmons is with us, the U.S. Navy sailor who served on board the USS Ronald Reagan, participating in the class action lawsuit against TEPCO. This April, Simmons will medically retire from the military. In San Francisco, California, we're joined by one of his attorneys, Charles Bonner, who's representing the class action lawsuit. And via Democracy Now! Video stream from Yokohama, Japan, we're joined by Kyle Cleveland, sociology professor and associate director of the Institute for Contemporary Asian Studies at Temple University's Japan campus in Tokyo. Cleveland's recent article in the Asia Pacific Journal is called "Mobilizing Nuclear Bias: The Fukushima Nuclear Crisis crisis and the politics of uncertainty. In it, he published transcripts of the Navy's phone conversations about Fukushima that took place back in March of 2011, 3 years ago at the time of the disaster. We welcome you all to Democracy Now! Let's go first to Lieutenant Steve Simmons, the U.S. Navy sailor who participated in the Fukushima relief efforts. Can you talk, Lieutenant Simmons, about what happened on March 11th, 2011, 3 years ago? Where were you, and what were you called to do?
Well, after the earthquake and tsunami that devastated the shores of Japan, the Ronald Reagan had already been on a scheduled deployment, and following that earthquake and tsunami, we were called away from our exercise there in the Pacific to provide humanitarian assistance to the citizens of Japan.
And what happened next?
We arrived on, if I remember correctly, the 12th of March, so the following day, which had been after the first reactor had already melted down, and the understanding of everybody on board was that there's no health risk, no dangers as far as the radiation exposure goes. At one point, we had actually sat in the plume off the reactor for approximately 5 hours, and another time we actually had to secure the water system because we actually had brought contaminants up into the water.
How close were you to it?
Honestly, at this point, I hear conflicting stories each time. I know I've seen photos where you can clearly see the mountains of Japan right there in the background. So if I remember correctly, the human eye can only see about 17 miles on the horizon. So you're clearly within visible distance, but then there's also reports that we were no closer than 160 miles. So at this point, which one's accurate? I'm not exactly, I would have to believe the photos.
And Lieutenant Simmons, at the time you weren't aware that you were being exposed to any radiation. When did you start feeling the impact on your health, and what are some of the things that have happened since?
It wasn't until November of 2011. We returned in September. The end of November, I had started noticing something was wrong. The first thing was I was actually driving into work. I was driving down Route 50 heading into Arlington, and I had blacked out and drove my truck up on a curb. Following that, I started coming down with what maybe I thought was just maybe a flu, started running fevers. I dropped about 20 to 25 pounds unexpectedly, and then started experiencing night sweats, difficulty sleeping, and had been back and forth to the doctor numerous times for lab work and other studies to try to figure out what's been going on. And from January to March of 2012, I had been hospitalized 3 different times. The first hospitalization, they couldn't figure anything out. The only thing they supposedly came up with was a sinus infection and just kind of blew off the thought that radiation had anything to do with it. In fact, the intern told me that if it was radiation, I should have seen symptoms long before now. 3 days later, after I was discharged, I was back in the hospital because my lymph nodes started swelling and still running constant fevers as high as 102.9. During the second hospitalization is when I was actually just coming out of the restroom and my legs buckled on me. And at that point, from that point on, they hadn't been the same. It was probably about April time frame when I started using a wheelchair for long distances. And then by the summer of 12, I had to start using a wheelchair full time. Every time I would try to stand or do anything, my legs would shake and muscles start twitching, and it just progressed from there. And now the muscle weakness affects my legs, my arms, my hands, and now everything is still progressing, and there's now issues with signals going from the brain to bladder as well. So that's another issue that I'm dealing with now.
You're sitting in a wheelchair right now.
I am.
We also wanted to bring Charles Bonner into the conversation from San Francisco. Charles Bonner, can you talk about the other people who are part of this class action suit? How did you find out about them? What are the ailments they're experiencing?
Yes, thank you very much, Amy, for having me on your show. We initially started out with only 8 plaintiffs, 8 people who had contacted us as of December of 2012. By June of 2013, we had 51 sailors and Marines who had contacted us with various illnesses, including thyroid cancers, testicular cancers, brain cancers, unusual uterine problems, excessive uterine bleeding, all kinds of gynecological problems, problems that you do not see in a population of 20-year-olds, 22-year-olds, 23-year-olds, even 35-year-olds, as is Lieutenant Simmons, his age. So now we have filed a class action for approximately 100 sailors, and every day we're still receiving calls from sailors with these various problems. Just a couple of days ago, I received a call from a father whose son now has lung cancer. The total number of sailors who responded to this Operation Tomodachi — Tomodachi is a Japanese word meaning friend, so this was an operation help our friends. The total number of U.S. sailors who responded was approximately 24,000, but there were a total of 70,000 U.S. servicemen and women who ultimately were first responders, and that include servicemen and women who were based in Japan. So we have filed this class action lawsuit on behalf of all of them, because one thing is very clear. They all were exposed to radiation. We can debate the level of radiation, and we are not suing the Navy, and we're not accusing the Navy of having done anything improper. Of course, no one in the Navy would knowingly expose these young sailors and Marines to high levels of radiations that one commander measured at 30 times normal, and 30 times more than what TEPCO, the Tokyo Electric Power Company, represented to the public and to the U.S. Navy. The responsible party for these young sailors' injury is the Tokyo Electric Power Company, the 4th largest power company in the world. Tokyo Electric Power Company failed to tell the public, including the Navy, that they were in an active meltdown. They had triple meltdown following the earthquake and the tsunami. They didn't have batteries. They didn't have backup power. They didn't have any kind of auxiliary water supply to cool these reactors down. They actually called to the headquarters of Tokyo Electric Power Company for the power company to dispatch batteries to them, and they did. But the trucks carrying the batteries got mired into traffic because of the tsunami. So meanwhile, you have these managers frantically in the dark trying to figure out what to do. They sent their workers out into the dark to get car batteries. So these workers in the storm, raising their hoods, extracting car batteries, going back in with flashlight, trying to figure out how to connect the batteries to the water supply so that they can cool the reactors. Meanwhile, these young sailors on board of the USS Ronald Reagan are cruising into this unknown. They do not know all of this disaster is occurring, but more importantly, TEPCO does not tell them that they're in an active meltdown, that the reactor number 1 has melted down within 4 hours following the earthquake, and there have been all kinds of explosions. Major releases are happening. There's radioactive releases, including 300 tons of radioactive water is being released into the Pacific Ocean. And as Mr. Simmons will tell you, these young sailors were using this desalinated water. They were bathing in it. They were brushing their teeth with it. They were cooking with it. And so they were ingesting this radiation both through food and water as well as the air. And now they're all sick. And so we have to put the sailors first. This is Operation Tomodachi. Now it's Operation Help Our Friends, the U.S. sailors and young Marines. They have all kinds of problems. I'd like to just take 1 second and read you Just a paragraph from one declaration from one of our young lady sailors. She's 32, and she states that, quote, during Operation Tomodachi, I began having migraine headaches, irregular menstrual cycles, knee surgery, breast surgery, and leg surgery to remove unexplained mass from these areas. This radiation not only hurts the young sailors, but it hurts their offsprings. This is a declaration from the wife of a sailor who writes in her declaration to the court, my husband was exposed to radiation particles while assigned to the 7th Fleet on the USS Ronald Reagan, assisting in Operation Tomodachi beginning in March of 2011. As a result of this exposure, our son, who was born on November 14, 2012, at 8 months was diagnosed with brain and spine cancer. These are just a few examples of what these young sailors are dealing with. And one last report. This is a sailor who's 22, has been diagnosed with leukemia, and is losing his eyesight. And he writes in his declaration to the court, upon my return from Operation Tomodachi, I began losing my eyesight. I lost all vision in my left eye and most vision in my right eye. I am unable to read street signs, and I'm no longer able to drive. Prior to Operation Tomodachi, I had 20/20 eyesight, wore no glasses, and had no corrective eye surgery. Additionally, I know of no family member who have had leukemia. So these are examples of the kinds of illnesses and injuries that these young sailors are experiencing.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion. Charles Bonner, attorney, joining us from San Francisco. Lieutenant Steve Simmons, a U.S. Navy sailor. And when we come back, we'll also be joined by Kyle Cleveland. He's a professor. He'll join us from Yokohama, Japan, to talk about documents he obtained of backstage conversations among U.S. officials about the radiation risk at the time that all of this was happening 3 years ago this month. This is Democracy Now! Back in a minute.